Okay, so this webinar forms part of the Wilder Future for Warwickshire project, which is generously funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And the idea is that we are training young adults in conservation and in being able to communicate about that conservation so that we can raise awareness about the environment and things that you feel passionate about. So our hashtags are down the bottom here if you do want to use anything on social media, if you want to post anything about the webinar or the project. I think most of you are already part of it, but if you aren't, this is the website where you can find out more information about it and you can inquire about signing up. Just a quick note to say that next week we have a webinar on small mammals. So this is new and I've just put it online, so please do go to the website and feel free to book on. Okay, so I think that's enough from me. So I will stop my screen share and I will pass you on to Imogen, who is our lovely guest speaker who's going to tell you all about the wonderful world of slugs. And she'll tell you whether to mute your mics or unmute them, or to keep your cameras on or off.
Thanks, Debbie. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to talk about how wonderful slugs are. I'm just going to start sharing my screen, so hopefully you can all now see my lovely desktop. And okay. So yes, today or this evening we're going to be talking all about slugs. So hopefully, so the plan for this evening is we're going to start off getting to know each other a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, and then I want you to tell me a little bit about you and what you know about slugs already. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what makes a slug, slug ecology and diversity, how and where to find slugs, and how to actually get started with recording slugs. And at the end, we're just going to recap and say, what do you know about slugs now? And we also have a fun little quiz for the end if we have time, if I don't talk for too long. So hopefully by the end of this evening, you'll be able to understand the differences between slugs and snails, understand a little bit about slug anatomy, be able to recognise a few different slug families, know how to actually record slugs, and recognise a couple of iconic species of conservation concern. So a little bit about me. I did a master's in conservation ecology with Debbie at Oxford Brookes in 2015 and 2016. I then went out and did a natural talent traineeship funded by the Conservation Volunteers and Esby Fairbairn Foundation, which is all about identification of non-marine mollusks. So that's just slugs, snails, freshwater snails and freshwater bivalves. I spent a year doing that at the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff, training with the National Slug Recorder, who we'll be talking about again later on this evening. I'm now actually doing a PhD on slug and snail diversity in gardens with the Royal Horticultural Society and Newcastle University, also with support from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. This means I do spend an awful lot of time talking about slugs in the garden and slugs as pests. I'm going to try and avoid that kind of negative language today, but please do forgive me if I slip in that P word anywhere today. It's just a force of habit because I'm so used to talking to gardeners about this issue. Since 2019, I've also been invited to sit on the council for the Conchological Society of Britain and Ireland, which is one of the oldest societies in Britain studying slugs and snails. So I have a really strong interest in slugs and snails. It's basically most of my career and my life is spent talking about these slimy animals. So my PhD is all about trying to understand what slugs are where in Britain and which ones are problems for gardeners and which ones gardeners should learn to appreciate a bit more. So I have three main projects as part of that. So I've got the RHS Cellar Slug Survey, which you may have come across at some point already. We also have the Slugs Count project, which is a year-long study involving 60 different volunteers around the UK who are helping me investigate slugs in their garden. And I'm also doing a lot of pest status work, so looking at feeding choice experiment data, to try and understand which slugs are actually beneficial to gardeners and which ones potentially could have some conflict with. And I have 5 lovely supervisors who keep me in line and make sure that I behave myself and do the right thing, which is great. So that was enough about me. I thought it'd be nice if we could get to know each other a little bit. So if you don't mind unmuting yourself, we'll go round in the order that you appear on my screen. I just want you to say who you are, where you are today. You can be as vague as you like on that, and what made you want to join in today. If you don't have a microphone, please do use the text chat function. That's absolutely fine. Or if you don't feel comfortable with your voice being recorded as well. So I'm going to stop sharing screen for now so that I can see everyone's faces. So if we start with Thomas, because you're first on my screen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, yep, I'm Tom. I don't know much about slugs at all, but I'm very interested to learn a little bit more. And I'm just at home at the moment.
There you go. Becca, you're next on my screen.
Hi, I'm Becca. I think you asked where we are right now, so I'm currently in Warwickshire. And I joined in today. I do some research, but I research flies, so as pests. So it's actually really interesting learning about slugs as pests, because I don't know anything about slugs at all.
Great. Sally, you're next on my screen.
Hi, I'm Sally. This is Max.
Hi, Max.
I don't know a lot about slugs. My dad really wants me to find out what the giant orange ones are that keep eating all the dog food. Yeah, that's about all I know.
Okay, thank you. Eleanor, you're next on my screen.
Hi, I'm in Leamington Spa at the moment. Equally don't really know anything about slugs. I did a bit of stuff about them in my degree, but that was mostly about it was mostly about snails, and then we did a bit about tropical slugs, but literally like 10 minutes, so yeah.
Sounds interesting. Thank you. Isabella, you're next on my screen.
Yeah, hi, I'm Isabella. I'm an engineering student in Leamington Spa. And my only experience with slugs is the 10s that have been in our kitchen in the past month. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I like slugs, but we'll see how that goes.
Okay, it's great that you've joined in. Emma, you're next on my screen. Oh, you're muted at the moment.
Sorry. Yeah, so I'm Emma. I'm in Kenilworth. I don't know anything about slugs except I try and keep them off lettuces in my garden, but we actually have like blue slate in the garden, so I normally try and just build a little wall, and that seems to work rather than using anything more kind of chemical.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
Brilliant, thank you. Michael, you're next. Is it Michael or John? I'm not sure which.
Michael John, all one name.
Oh wow,
it's
that's
really
great.
awkward. I'm Michael John. I'm in Coventry. I've been interested in slugs for about 2 years, but I didn't really do anything until about earlier this year. But found I had some difficulties like trying to ID them beyond family level. I'm confident at family level because I mostly see Ryonidae. I've only seen one other one that's not that family. So I was hoping this talk could answer some of the questions that I have on like the features and also where to look for them apart from my back garden. So yeah.
Okay, that's great. Brilliant, thank you. Who have I missed? Sorry, everyone's jumped around on the screen now. Courtney, I don't think we've done you yet.
Hi, I'm Courtney. I'm at home in Coventry. I don't know anything about slugs, but I'm just trying to join any webinar I can on any animal, really.
That's brilliant. No problem at all. Hopefully by the end of the day you'll have learned a little bit. And I think Abigail's the only person I haven't asked yet. Oh, she's vanished. Okay. Oh no, you're there. Sorry, you've just appeared.
Hiya.
Everything's moving. It's very confusing.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's not your fault. It's Zoom.
I'm Abigail. I'm in Lutterworth, so just on the border of Warwickshire. I don't know anything about slugs. I'm just interested to see what I can learn tonight.
No problem. Have I missed anyone in all the Zoom shuffling? Nope. Okay, that's great. Thanks. It's lovely to see all of you and to say hello. So at least we know who each other are. If you do have any questions as we go through, either feel free to interrupt me or stick them in the chat and I'll try and get to them. But we'll have plenty of time at the end, hopefully, for you to also ask any questions if you do have any. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen again. Oh, that's a good point. So hopefully you can still see the slide again. And actually, the next thing I wanted you to do, in fact, I don't need to share my screen, is I want you to actually tell me what you do actually know about slugs so far. So you've already told me, most of you, that you don't know much. But what I would like you to try and do, this is a bit of an experiment. Someone else did it in something else I attended and I thought it was quite fun. I'm going to post the link in the chat. And if you click on it, it will take you to a board where you can put post-it notes on the board. They're completely anonymous, so you can put anything you like on the post-it notes. And you can also upvote post-it notes. So if someone else writes something and you agree with it, you can vote on it and say, and it will add like a +1 to it. And I just want you to put on the left-hand side of that board any post-it notes you like, telling us what you know about slugs. You can be as general as you like, or you can be quite specific. It doesn't really matter. I'll give you a couple of minutes to play with that. Yes, they are most certainly slimy. I like that someone's gone straight in there with that one. Some great things coming in. Keep it up, guys. That's brilliant. Oh, some good facts. Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to start sharing my screen again. So this time. And we'll come back to that at the end of the session. So you can put your post-it notes on the other side, showing what you now think you know about slugs. So then we can see, kind of get an idea of what you've actually learned today. Okay, so what is actually a slug? So slugs belong to the phylum of invertebrates. So that's just a group of invertebrates known as the mollusca, which includes lots of other organisms like octopus, squid, clams, scallops, oysters, chitons, that kind of thing. They're all closely related to each other. It's actually one of the oldest groups of organisms on the planet, so it's been around a very long time. What ties all these organisms together is they all have this fleshy flap of skin known as the mantle, and the way this appears on different mollusks is different. So for the chiton, for example, it's kind of this skirt-like thing around here, and on the squid it's quite adapted, so it's more this structure here. And on slugs and snails it's also quite different again. But that's generally what ties them all together. And for most of them, they also have some kind of shell or shell remnant as well. So within that, slugs and snails belong to the class Gastropoda, which comes from the Greek word gastro, referring to stomach, and poda, referring to foot. And it's simply related to the way that slugs and snails appear to slide around on their stomachs. So that's why they're known as the Gastropoda. So a lot of things people ask me about is how slugs are actually different to snails. Well, the truth is they're actually quite closely related. Slugs have originally evolved from snails. So first land snails colonized the land, and then from that land snails evolved and shrunk and simplified the coiled shells, reduced them down to turn into slugs. This process has happened at many different times, producing many different families of slug. The shell is usually still present in a slug, depending on the family, but it's normally an internal shell. So for example, the slug on the slide here, you can just about make out this whitish hump here. That's actually the shell showing through the skin of the slug. there's a lot of S's in that sentence. So you can see that the skin is so thin and translucent that you can actually make out this whitish patch, which is the shell inside the skin. Slugs only make up about 1/3 of terrestrial mollusk species in Britain. So there's a lot more species of snails present than there are slugs. However, we tend to see more species of slugs around easily because the majority of species of snail actually mature at a really tiny size, whereas we get some really, really big species of slug. The biggest threat to any slug or a snail is simply drying out. Shells provide a huge amount of protection for snails from this, and snails can actually cover the mouth of their shells with this temporary structure made of calcium here, which helps prevent this. However, slugs are much more vulnerable. So losing the shell has meant that they can dry out a lot more easily, so they're a lot more prone to actually dying that way. But they have the benefit of losing the heavy coiled shell and actually being able to squeeze under objects and into cracks in the soil in areas that places that snails would struggle to get to. And this provides them a lot of protection as well. And they can respond really quickly to environmental conditions like rain and frost and things like that. So during these kind of hot, dry conditions or really cold conditions, they'll often squeeze down into the soil and remain there dormant. Though some slugs do have an annual life cycle, so they will die back during the winter. They can also produce protective cells in the soil as well. So they'll actually create like a little hole in the soil and line that with mucus to keep them nice and wet while they sit there dormantly waiting for the weather conditions to improve. But it's not easy being a slug or a snail. A lot of gardeners, particularly, I spend a lot of time talking to gardeners, are not fans of slugs. What I find quite interesting is that they all tend to look at a slug and assume that every slug is the same. So I actually found this particular image from a gardening website, which I've not credited because I don't want to name and shame them. And this is apparently the most harmful slugs you can find in the garden. So we've got 4 different species on here actually. This one here can be a pest of things like potatoes, so I can understand why it's on there. You've got this one here, Durosus reticulatum, is the most widespread species possible to find in Britain, and it can be a major crop pest, so it could be a problem in the garden. And then you've got this one at the bottom here, which is Limicus maculatus, which is actually not a harmful slug at all. It feeds entirely on rotting material like fungi, lichens and algae as well. So it doesn't actually damage garden plants as far as we know. So to say that it's one of the most harmful is a bit of a shame, really. The diet of slugs is actually quite complicated. There's at least 42 slug species that we know the diets roughly of. So about 28% of these species are omnivorous, meaning they'll eat absolutely anything. So that would include live plants, but also include things like dead animals, animal waste, any rotting material, just anything they can find really, they'll have a go at it. Quite distressingly, some of them have even been recorded eating nestlings in birds' nests as well, in very rare instances. So it just goes to show that they're completely opportunistic and they'll eat pretty much everything they can find. Then you've got 17% that are fungivorous, meaning that they pretty much only feed on fungi or things like lichens as well. So they're not going to be harmful to the garden at all if you're a gardener. Then you've got a 12% that are carnivorous. So these actually feed on earthworms. So they live on the soil and feed on earthworms. But before you start panicking about how much earthworms they might consume, they actually have a really slow digestive rate. They're probably one of the most primitive forms of slug. And I think one paper I saw said that they probably only feed on about 10 earthworms a year. So really, really slow numbers of earthworms that they're actually eating. And then you've got about 26%, which are herbivores, meaning that they feed mainly on plant material. But within that, it's not really broken down into whether they feed on live plant material or dead plant material, because we know that some species probably feed more on dead plant material than live, but there's not enough evidence to actually support that. Then we've got another 17% where we just don't understand what they eat at all. So we just don't have enough information. But I'll explain a bit later on why this is the case for those. So a quick question for you. You can either put thumbs up, down, or shout, or whatever you like. Do slugs and snails have teeth? Can see some thumbs up coming in. Some real thumbs up as well. Oh, there's a thumb down going on. Another thumbs up. It is true, they do have teeth. In fact, they have thousands and thousands of tiny teeth. Depending which species in Britain, it can be between 2,000 and I think 7,000 tiny teeth. And there's a picture, like a microscope image of what these teeth can look like here. These are on a process known as the radula, which is almost like a tongue-like structure within the mouth, and they're arranged in rows. Now, the structure and arrangement of the teeth varies depending on the slug's diet. So on the left here, we've got a Limicus species. So this is one of those species that feeds mainly on rotting material, but it will also graze things like algae and lichens. So it probably needs sharp teeth to actually scrape things off hard surfaces, which might explain why it's got two different types of teeth in different arrangements. The one on the right-hand side here is the ghost slug, which is completely carnivorous. So this one only feeds on earthworms, and you can see the teeth are arranged quite differently. They're in this kind of chevron shape here, and it's got this channel down the middle. So this will allow them to use their radula a bit like a chainsaw in rotating it around itself and pull the earthworm it's feeding on down this central channel into its stomach. And as it's going, it's grinding it up as well. So very different teeth based on different functions. So just to give you an idea of how this works, I've got an image of a snail here. So you've got the radula inside the mouth here, like a tongue, and then it actually uses these muscles to push it outside the mouth and scrape it along whatever it's feeding on and pull it back into its mouth and pull the food with it. This can actually leave behind some quite distinctive and pretty patterns, particularly when they're grazing on things like algae on something like a fence post here. And it actually leaves these kind of marks behind, and you can actually see where the feeding has happened. So the snail in this case has kind of zigzagged from side to side and had these short feeding intervals as it goes. In theory, you could actually identify different species of slug and snail using these. However, I don't know of anyone who has the expertise to actually do that, and I certainly don't. So I couldn't tell you which species caused these patterns. It's also a tricky life being a slug or a snail because pretty much everything wants to eat you. This is just a few examples of different things from papers that I've come across where they've talked about these groups or these certain animals eating slugs and snails. And some of these are actually quite dependent on slugs and snails for their diet. So things like the snail killing flies obviously are very reliant on snails. And some also do parasitize slugs as well. You've also got some more generalist things, so even hedgehogs, things like foxes and badgers will even use slugs to supplement their diet in tough conditions. Slow worms, many amphibians and reptiles use slugs and snails as part of their diet. Even some spiders have been known to feed on slugs as well. So it's obviously a good food source for a wide range of animals. You even have snails that will eat other snails as well. So for example, in this top picture here, this little snail is actually eating the bigger one. So it's quite impressive when you see this happening. There's also some iconic animals such as the glowworm that also feeds on entirely on a diet of snails. So in this case, the larvae has found a snail. It's actually bitten the snail and injected a paralysing fluid, and it's just riding around on the back of the snail waiting for it to take effect so that it can come down and feed on the body of the snail. This is actually one I came across on my walk into work once, and there was great excitement, lots of picture taking. I actually went and got my colleagues out of the office and they came and took loads of pictures with it as well. Much to the amusement of some builders stood nearby who were just like, what are you doing? What is this? And when we explained, they still didn't get it. But it was amazing to see. But as well as having things that want to eat you, there's also some parasites that live on you and want to suck your blood. So there's actually at least 2 species of slug and snail mite, which live exclusively on slugs and snails. They can't transfer to any other host. When they were first spotted by biologists, they actually thought that they were just hitching a ride, but they've come to realise that no, they feed exclusively on slugs and snails, and they're actually feeding on the blood of the slug or the snail that they're parasites of. And often you'll see these little white mites running around on the slug or snail itself, and it will run into the breathing pore, which takes them directly to the lung and gets them really close to the blood source, because the heart is right next to the lung as well. So yeah, not very pleasant for the slug or the snail, but fortunately they seem to be able to have host large numbers of these with no obvious ill effect. So, you know, you don't really want to kill your host if it's supplying you with food. One of the really interesting things about slugs, I think in particular, is that they have really fascinating sex lives. So all slugs are hermaphroditic, so which means they're both male and female at the same time. So finding a partner is pretty straightforward. You just need to find someone the same species as you. In some cases, they don't even have to be the same species as you, which makes life a little bit complicated for us taxonomists. But also they will mutually exchange sperm most of the time. So this means that you want to find a partner and woo them basically into sharing their sperm with you, and you giving them their sperm at the same your sperm at the same time. And the mating habits actually vary a lot between different species groups. So for example, this one at the top here, it has a specialized little organ which happens to be sticking outside of its head here, which it will use to try and woo its partner by stroking sensuously along the slug's back, just trying to get it in the mood. If the partner reciprocates, everything's going well. It will also do the same behavior at the same time. But at a certain point during courtship, it gets a bit more complicated in that they'll actually start biting each other's tails and thrashing around and smacking each other in the face with their tails. Eventually this will go on for a few seconds or maybe a minute or two, and then they'll go back to the sensuous stroking again. And this behavior cycles for at least half an hour in some cases, sometimes even an hour. Very strange behavior, and it's thought to be actually that they're transferring hormones during that time. So maybe that's why they have such a complicated courtship. There's definitely a bit of a sexual war going on in trying to make sure that your partner uses your sperm. For other groups, this is a bit different. So for these slugs at the bottom here, they tend to just follow each other for a while, and then they'll actually circle around together, extrude the genitalia in the middle, fertilize each other at the same time before heading off and doing their own thing. So a much kind of quicker, more simple process in a way. Then you've got the leopard slugs, which are quite famous for their amazing mating behavior. So David Attenborough actually covered this, and there's a lovely video of it on YouTube. So they actually form this long mucus rope together. They then twine their bodies around each other, extrude the genitalia below them as this kind of bluish mass, and fertilize each other. While they're actually doing this, they're actually spinning as well. So it's quite mesmerizing to see. When they're finished, they'll either then drop to the ground and crawl away, or sometimes they'll actually crawl back up the mucus rope, eating it as they go. So they're not wasting any energy that way. So really interesting things happening, lots of interesting courtship going on. But it's not just sex that's weird. You also get some slugs that have defensive behaviours, which are a bit unusual. And in fact, in some cases, you can actually use these behaviours to help identify them. So someone mentioned earlier that they wanted to know what those big red slugs are. This is actually one of the methods we use sometimes to tell those species apart, because there's several very similar looking species. What you actually do is you poke them gently in the head to get them to contract to a dome shape. And some species will do this dancing or rocking behaviour. So there's no sound to this video, but hopefully you can see this is a fully contracted slug. And what it's doing is it's kind of rocking its body from side to side. The front part of the body is slightly out of sync with the back, which kind of gets this rhythmic rocking back and forth. We have absolutely no idea what the function of this is. Why would they do this? I mean, the only theory we have is it's to deter predators, but if I was a predator, I don't think I'd be very put off by this kind of gentle rocking. And these slugs actually have really good defenses as well, because they have this really thick, sticky slime and really thick, rubbery skin. So once they get to this size, when they do this behavior, they're not very palatable anymore for most animals anyway. So very strange behavior, and we just don't really understand why they do it. But some species will do it and others won't. So it can be quite a useful field character to actually tell those apart. And that's one of the benefits of slug slime. Like most people have said, slugs are slimy, and that is very, very true. This slime provides a huge amount of protection. So for snails, they tend to just have one type of slime, which can also give them a lot of protection, which they use for movement. And slugs also have this similar slime, which they use for movement as well. And this provides so much protection that they can do things like this, crawling over a razor blade, because what they're essentially doing is they're gliding over this sheet of mucus and never really touching the surface of whatever they're on. What's quite amazing about this movement slime as well is it has this unusual property of acting like a liquid when it's not compressed, but as soon as you compress it, it acts like a solid. So it really is like they're sliding over a solid surface as they're moving. Slugs actually do produce two different types of slime at least. So they've got the movement slime, which compresses and acts like a solid when they're going over it, but you also have a defensive slime, which is often a completely different colour and consistency to the movement slime. And this can sometimes be quite useful in helping to identify what species you have in your hand. For example, in some species, it can be very milky kind of slime, and in others, it can be something like bright orange. So it can also be useful to help differentiate between species. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is, if I can get it up, there we go. I'm going to launch a poll, and I'd like you to just say how many species you think are present in Britain and Ireland. I've already kind of given you the answer earlier, so we'll see if you were paying attention or not. Okay, that's great. Most people were paying attention. Brilliant, well done. Yes, there's about 40 species present in Britain and Ireland, probably around 44. The reason why I'm so vague about the actual number is there's a lot of debate with taxonomists as to whether some species are separate species or whether they're subspecies. So it's hard to be incredibly precise about this number. Okay. The good news is only about 9 of these are considered serious plant pests. Our definition of what a plant pest is in terms of any animal really is actually based on their ability to reproduce very quickly and cause a high level of damage to agricultural crops. So when we talk about slugs as pests, all our knowledge is kind of based on what we know of them is from agriculture. So whether that translates directly to a garden or not, we're not entirely sure. But it's good news that only about 9 are considered serious plant pests. The rest either can have a minor problem for us as gardeners because they feed on live plants, but generally don't cause enough of an issue to be considered a pest. So we've got that pesty P word out the way, so hopefully we won't have to dwell on that too much more. But there is actually one species of slug that's protected under law, and I'll be talking about that one later on. What is fascinating about studying slugs as well is we actually didn't realise how many species were present in Britain until about 2014, when they decided to create a new guide, the FSC Guide to Slugs of Britain and Ireland, which is an absolutely wonderful book, and I'll be talking about that again later on. Debbie's holding up a copy. Fantastic. And they did a really thorough study for this, in where they went out into as many natural environments as possible. They didn't really focus on gardens, they're just natural environments, and collected all the slug species they could find. They also then did some morphological work and also DNA work to assess what species were present in Britain based on what we knew, and actually looking at wider European literature as well to figure out what was here now. And they actually discovered 20% more species than we realised were established in Britain. So basically overnight, our understanding of what slugs are present changed dramatically. What's strange about this is less than half the slug fauna is actually considered native to Britain. So most of these weren't native to Britain. However, it is worth pointing out that in the mollusk world, most of our definitions of whether something is native or not is very strict and very harsh. So it has to have been present since or before the Ice Age to be considered a native species. So gives us a little bit of a mean approach to slugs in a way. But what is particularly interesting is that many species appear to be arriving or changing range in Britain over recent centuries very rapidly as well in some cases. And there's actually very little known about many species of slug, particularly those ones that are not native and particularly those that have arrived fairly recently, because overall worldwide slugs are pretty understudied as a group. So this is from that FSC guide, and it's just a lovely overview of what all the slug species present in Britain look like. So you can see direct comparison. So we've got some really, really big ones. These are all to scale with each other, and also some really tiny ones. So they're mature at a small size. You can see there's some differences. Some look very different colours and patterns to each other's, but there's also a lot of similarities. Some are very similar looking as well, unless you're very familiar with slugs. So there's a big range of diversity really there. However, that's actually not a complete image of the fauna, because in 2016 they added another species present in Britain. So new discoveries are still being made. There's still more slugs arriving. So this is a semi-slug, which I'll be talking about later on as well. So basically these are slugs that have not quite lost their entire shell. So they've retained a coiled shell, but they just can't pull their body into it anymore like a snail can. So they're considered a semi-slug, which means they often appear in the snail books, but they also get included in the slug books as well. So they get to be in both worlds, which is quite fun. What's interesting particularly about this one is that it's found in one piece of forestry in West Wales. It's even in Southeast Wales. And it's thought that it actually came in on some planting. So when they planted the trees there, they accidentally brought this semi-slug over with them. It doesn't seem to have spread outside that woodland, but the gentleman who found it actually went back this year and discovered that the population is still going really strong and it's surviving very well there. But luckily it doesn't seem to be able to spread it wider into the natural environment. It's probably not a major problem for our native species, but it is predatory. So it could actually feed on things like earthworms or other slug species. So it does have potential to maybe do some harm to our natural wildlife as well. It's not all bad news though. We do have some native species that are incredibly interesting and of conservation importance. One of these is the lemon slug, which is restricted entirely to ancient woodland sites. And this is because it feeds on fungi that are associated with old trees. So it tends to only be found around those areas. We also have another ancient woodland specialist, which is the ash black slug. This one's a little bit more tolerant in that it will survive in areas where ancient woodland has been removed. So it's a little bit less strictly defined to ancient woodland. Whereas the lemon slug will not survive in areas where ancient woodland has been removed at all, which is why it's often considered an indicator species. We also have our one protected species of slug, which is the Kerry slug. This is only found in Ireland and Northern Ireland, so we wouldn't expect to find that in Warwickshire at all, but it's just nice to be aware that this exists and we do have a protected species. It's quite unusual for a slug as well because it is an acidic habitat specialist. So it only really found in acidic woodland. But again, it sticks to woodland habitat where it feeds on things like lichens. And there's a lot of research going on into this species because of its European protected status. And it seems to be doing pretty well in Ireland, actually. It's even been found in forestry in Northern Ireland now, where it wasn't present before. So habitat is really important for slugs. Particularly snails as well. So different species are found often in different places. And this can include bigger habitats, but also microhabitats within that larger habitat. So for example, some species might be found in woodland, whereas others might only be found in ancient woodland, or even within areas of woodland, they need very damp conditions to actually be present. Whereas others are much more tolerant and much more generalist. Generally with slugs and snails, it's not so much true of slugs, but certainly for snails, they are heavily reliant on a source of calcium to produce their shells. So any calcium-rich habitat is likely to have a lot more diversity of slugs and snails in it than any calcium-poor habitats. Slugs are slightly less restricted by this because of the fact that they have such reduced shells, and in some cases no shell really at all, so they're much more tolerant of habitat conditions, but generally in a really acidic dry, sandy habitat, you will not find many slug species at all. So going as an example of the habitat specialist, we'll go back to that lemon slug. So as I've mentioned before, it's restricted to ancient woodland. The adults are only ever found in the autumn and winter months. And this is simply because they come up during that time from beneath the ground to feed on the fruiting bodies of the fungi, which they're entirely reliant on. We actually don't really know what they do the rest of the year, but it's thought that they're actually underneath the ground feeding on the fungal hyphae, or kind of the roots of the fungi itself, during the rest of the time of the year. And we don't really know what the juveniles look like that much, or even what the eggs look like, because they're just so under-observed. In contrast, example of a habitat generalist, you might have seen a slug like this before. This is known as the large black slug. I know a lot of the big slugs get boring names, and you can see it's just completely black all over. It actually occurs in almost all habitats within Britain and can tolerate really harsh conditions that other species won't, such as heath, uplands, that kind of places. So for example, when I've gone walking in Scotland before on the top of mountains, I've come across this species there and know the slug species in sight. They're also a bit more daylight tolerant than most slug species as well. So often you'll see these slugs out and about in the daytime if there's nice damp conditions. For example, just after it's rained, they'll be out and about. However, although this species is considered really widespread and occurs pretty much everywhere, it's actually under-recorded, as it can be quite difficult to identify. This is considered to be one of our native species of slug, but we have a problem of that it can hybridize with several introduced species, causing lots of issues with actually trying to identify it. So how to actually look for slugs? So it's useful to know that slugs really are dependent on moisture, so they really like damp areas. They're also most active at night, so it's easier to find them at night time, be out and about crawling around. But if you can't search at night time, obviously, you want to actually just do the low-tech thing, get down close to the ground, rummage around, see what you can find. During the daytime, they will shelter under objects, so you could actually put out traps in some cases. We call them traps, but there's no real trap behaviour to them in that. For example, this is just a piece of wood, and what happens is the piece of wood creates a nice damp, dark environment underneath it, which can attract some slugs and snails. So when you look underneath it, you might find some slugs and snails there. But it's not a real trap in that they can easily leave there if they want to. So if it becomes too dry and hot, they'll just go, and you're not actually harming them in any way. It's up to them whether they're there or not. But that's one way you can actually find them. The other way is just actually doing what I'm doing here and just rummaging around through leaf litter on the forest floor and actually looking for them that way. In your garden, you can also look in places like compost bins. They often shelter within there. And it's also digging through the soil, you also find them as well. Basically, any kind of moist environment is a good place to look. So once you've found your slugs, you probably want to start thinking about how to ID them. And it's quite useful to actually understand a bit about slug anatomy to do that. So most slugs have the same basic structure. There are a few differences though. So they all have this fleshy area here, which is kind of saddle shaped, known as the mantle. So if you remember at the beginning of the evening, I actually talked about how all mollusks have a mantle. So this is what their mantle looks like. Within that, they have a breathing pore. The position does change slightly based on what species you have present, or which family even. This is always on the right-hand side of a slug. If you ever find a slug with one on the left-hand side, get very excited, tell everyone you've ever met, because that's incredibly rare and has never ever been documented. This is one of the fascinating things about slugs and snails, is they're completely asymmetrical. So most of the business happens on the right-hand side. So you've got the breathing pore here, and then in most species next to that, you'll have your genital pore, which is where the genitalia will come out, but also your anal pore as well, so where you poop from. So all the pooping, breathing, and reproducing is happening from the same area on the right-hand side of the head in most cases. So pretty weird and wonderful that way. Now at the front of the slug, you have your head end. So you've got your two sets of tentacles. You've got a top set, which contains the eyes. You can actually see the eye nerves here, which are the blue kind of stripes in the tentacles. And the eyes are simple black dots on the end of these top set of tentacles. Eyesight's actually really poor in slugs. They kind of only really see shades of light and dark. They can't really see any definition at all. Instead, most sense that they have is actually through the bottom set of tentacles, which are used mainly for taste and smell. But also the sole of the foot can also detect a lot of these things as well. So they use the sole of the foot for taste and smell as well. Sometimes looking at the sole of foot can be very useful. It's always good to have a view of that because in different species, this can be different color or it can have a stripe of a color down the middle. So really important to also consider the underside of a slug. Then you have this long tail area. Sometimes this tail will have a raised ridge along the center of the back. This is known as the keel. So if you think about a boat upturned, it's that kind of pointy structure of a keel. And it's the same concept here. You've got this raised ridge-like line along the center of the back. But not all species have this. And it's usually quite important in knowing which family of slugs the one you have belongs to. And then not useful for identification, but useful to know where it is. The mouth is actually at the front here, next to the, kind of on the sole of the foot, next to the tentacles. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do now, hopefully this will work, is play a video for you. Some of the sound might not come through particularly well, and it might be a little bit juddery. But I'm happy to share the links with you at the end. I'll just check. Yes, I have sound sharing on. There are over 44 species of slugs present in Britain and Ireland, and many of these found in gardens. While some species can cause damage to plants, many may also play beneficial roles in the garden, so knowing what species you have found can be helpful in understanding if these are potential friends or foe. In this video, we're going to talk about what features to look at on a slug to try and identify it to species level. Most slugs have a similar body shape with a saddle-shaped fleshy area just behind the head called the mantle and a long tail section. Look at the mantle area to see whether there are any patterns like spots or stripes. Are the patterns regular or irregular? What colour is the rest of the body, particularly the tail area? Are there any markings on the body? What colour are they? Are they regular stripes, irregular blotches or spots? Or are the markings only between the body texture? Does the edge of the foot have a different colour? What colour is the sole of the foot? Is it all one colour or are parts of the sole a different colour? On the front of their heads, they have two sets of sensory tentacles. The top set usually contain the eyes. The colour of these tentacles can sometimes be helpful in species identification. The colour of slime that slugs produce can also be useful in identifying them to species. However, keep in mind that species can produce at least two different types of slime, one for everyday movement and one for defence. Often these are different in colour and texture. You can observe this by placing the slug on a piece of paper to see the mucus produced when they crawl. Gently rubbing the body sides with fingers or with a white tissue can reveal the colour of defensive slime. Not all slug species can be identified from photographs. Some species require dissection and examination of the genitalia to be able to identify them to species level. However, this usually applies to a few groups of species. If you are submitting records of slugs or asking for help with identification, it's essential to provide photographs for a second opinion. It is important to take photographs with multiple views of each slug you want identified, so that any characteristics important for that group or species is captured. These views should include a side view showing the right-hand side of the slug with the breathing pool visible, a top-down view showing the top of the slug, a view showing the sole of the foot. It is best to take these pictures of the slug while it is actively crawling so that all the colours and patterns are visible. Placing the slug on a sheet of glass or plastic, then gently turning it over is one way of getting a good photo of the sole of the foot. Gently rolling the slug over is another simple way to get this image while outside. Okay, so hopefully that's giving you an idea of how to actually look at a slug and how to actually take photographs ready for getting a record of a slug submitted. So the key points really to take away from that is that slugs are right-hand sided, so it's very important to get that right-hand side view, because often we do look at things to do with the breathing pore, so things like the pigmentation around it, to actually identify it to species. So it's really important to always have that right-hand side view. They can be quite difficult to identify from photos, which is why you need those multiple views. And we mainly rely on things like the body colour and pattern for a visual identification of species. But the slime colour can also be quite useful at times as well, so it's worth trying to make a note of that as well. So one more video to show you. This one's about 3.5 minutes long, and this will actually introduce the different family groups and hopefully give you an idea of how to identify those. There are 4 main groups of slugs you're likely to find in your garden. The roundback slugs, the Arionidae, the long-keeled slugs, the Melicidae and Botgorilidae, the short-keeled slugs, the Lamacidae and Agriolamacidae, and the shelled slugs, the Testacelidae. In this video, we'll run through the characters that make up these main groups. For a description of body parts, please see the previous video on how to get started with slug identification. The Arionidae family are known as the roundback slugs and are likely to be the most familiar looking slugs in the garden. The largest species in this family are often active during the daytime in wet weather. They are often brown, black, red or orange in colour, usually with an orange fringe at the edge of the foot. However, there are many smaller species within this family whose adults only reach a few centimetres in length. The feature unique to all members of this family is the presence of a mucus pore at the tip of the tail. This is a V-shaped structure. It's thought to be for harvesting the slime the slug has laid down to crawl over. In larger species in this family, a plug of mucus and dirt may be carried on the pore. It can be quite tricky to see this pore on the smallest species, but as soon as you spot this, you can firmly place the slug within this family. The Melicidae and Botgorilidae families are known as the long-keeled slugs for the distinctive ridge, known as the keel, that runs along the centre of their back all the way along the tail to the mantle. In some species, this raised ridge is obvious, as it can be a different colour from the rest of the body. For one species in particular, known as the worm slug, the raised keel can be much harder to spot. Fortunately, this small species has a long, slender worm-like body and is easily recognisable once familiar to you. For other species in these families, it can be important to look at the sole of the foot to see whether it has a dark central stripe in the middle or not. The Lamacidae and the Agriolamacidae families have a much shorter or no obvious raised ridge along the tail, so these are known as the short-keeled slugs. However, some species can have a different colour stripe running along the centre of the back, often known as a false keel. The Lamacidae have gently tapering tails, while the Agriolamacidae have blunt tail tips. The Lamacidae contain some of our largest slug species, with one species known to have reached up to 20 centimetres in length. The Agriolamacidae are much smaller, rarely reaching over 5 centimetres long as adults. The Testacelidae are very unusual looking for slugs, as they all have shells carried on the tip of their tail. These slugs spend most of their lives underground feeding on earthworms, so are very rarely seen above the soil surface. They can be instantly recognised by the fingernail-like shells that they carry on the tip of their tail. We hope that these videos have helped you understand more about how to identify slugs and feel better prepared to go out and look for slugs in your garden. Happy slug hunting! Okay. So obviously these videos are aimed towards people looking solely in their gardens, but they can also be applied to people looking for slugs in natural habitats as well. I should point that out. It's just simply my employer focuses on gardens. So I'll quickly run through those groups for you again, just so that we make sure we've got a good idea of what they look like. So the roundback slugs, the Arionidae, these are the really rounded back to them, and they have this exposed mucus pore at the tip of the tail, which as soon as you spot this, you can place any slug in that family. On the big species, they have this bright orange foot fringe, which is heavily striped. But on some of the smaller species, they don't have this feature, but they always have this mucus pore, so it's worth looking out for that. It's also worth pointing out that in some species, they'll get things stuck to them. So for example, this one's got some seeds stuck to it, and this one I think also has a little bit of dirt and a bit of plant material stuck to it as well. It's actually thought that these slugs might help disperse seeds in natural environments because of this habit. And it's also been shown that some plant seeds have adapted to be consumed by these slugs. So the slugs will actually eat the seed. As it passes through the digestion system, it scrapes off the coating of the seed itself and helps with germination. Meanwhile, the slug has actually moved and it's probably pooped the seed out somewhere else because it survived the digestive process and germinates somewhere else quite successfully. So they can actually have a quite useful function for plants in natural environments as well. But like I said, look out for that mucus pore. Sometimes it's got dirt stuck to it, and just keep an eye out. They can be very small on some of the tiny species. Then you've got the long-keeled slugs. So these are the ones with that long raised ridge going along the centre of the back. In some species, when they're humped up and contracted their bodies like that, it's quite obvious. It's quite raised and crinkly. Oops, sorry. Let's just switch the slide. And also it's a different colour, whereas in others it's much harder to see. So for example, this is the worm slug that was mentioned in the video, and you can see it's kind of got this pale keel that's almost a similar colour to the body, but it's quite hard to make out that it is a raised ridge, but it actually is. And then this one at the bottom here, again, this is a raised ridge as well, but when it's crawling it's harder to make out that this is actually raised. But every slug within this group has that raised ridge, so the long-keeled slugs. Then you have the short-keeled slugs, which is kind of the everything else group, really, in that they sometimes have a keel, but it's usually very short. So for example, in this species, it does have a bit of a raised keel when it's contracted, so you can kind of see this wrinkly effect, but it doesn't go all the way along the body to the mantle. So it's a lot shorter than in the long-keeled slugs. And then you've got other species like this one at the bottom here, where it's really, really short and you can barely see a keel at all. There's probably really not one there. The same thing here, it's got a very short keel along this very tip of the tail. And then in other species like the leopard slug here, sometimes they have markings right where the keel would be, but they don't actually have a keel. If you looked at this, you'd actually see it's flattened pigment and there's no raised ridge there at all. Then you have the shelled slugs, which are quite weird looking in that they have these long bodies and they actually have a shell at the tip of their tail. What's also unusual about the shelled slugs is they don't have that fleshy flap known as the mantle here anymore. It's completely gone. What happens is it's actually reduced down, so it's under the shell itself here, really tiny. So you wouldn't normally see that. So very unusual looking slugs. There's also a couple of groups that weren't mentioned in the video. We've got the ghost slug, which is just completely unique and weird, and belongs to a whole group of itself. In fact, there was a recent genetic study that discovered these slugs are more closely related to a group of snails in Britain than they are to any of our slugs. So they're really, really unusual. Like the shelled slugs, they have lost this fleshy mantle and it's reduced down to a little disc at the tip of the tail here. So it actually breathes out of its tail end, which is quite interesting. Also, what's weird about this slug is it's completely blind as far as we're aware. It doesn't have eye spots in its tentacles. So as far as we know, it isn't able to see anything anymore, which probably reflects the fact that it lives completely underground where it feeds on earthworms. This is not a native species to Britain. It was only discovered probably in around about 2010, I think was the first record. And it's thought to originally be from the kind of Ukrainian area or somewhere like that, but how it got to Britain, we don't know. And when it was discovered here, it was actually brand new to science, so they got to name it in Wales. So it's actually probably one of the few invertebrates and definitely the only slug with a Welsh scientific name. So Selachlymus is actually the genera that it got assigned to, which already had a species in it. So they didn't get that bit, but Uspryd is actually Welsh for spirit or ghost. So they've managed to put that in the scientific name, which is quite nice. So a lot of people get excited about these because they're quite unique looking. They were first found in Southeast Wales. Since then, they seem to have spread throughout Southeast Wales quite a bit. And we even had some records from Bristol area and even a couple of outlying records from Oxfordshire as well. So it's not completely unexpected that you might find this in Warwickshire, though as far as I know, there's no records of it so far. So it's worth keeping an eye out. A lot of people do find white slugs and get a bit excited thinking they found a ghost slug, but I should point out there are some other species that can be white. So the National Museum of Wales created this helpful little guide which points out those actual anatomy differences that you need to look for as well. So the ghost slug is completely white. It has these faint groups on the back. Sometimes it has a slight pearly colour to it as well. And the breathing hole is on the rear. And when it contracts, it sucks its head in and looks like a bit like a cylinder. Then you've got the shelled slugs, which are quite similar looking, though they're not close related, which again has that same body structure of not having this mantle area and having the shell on the tip of the tail here. Then you've got the field slug, which can be white and is quite commonly white as well. And it's got this fleshy mantle area at the front, which is very obvious, and the breathing hole is on the right hand side of the body near the head, whereas on these two it's not at all. It's actually at the tip of the tail, under the shell in this case. So it's well worth looking at the structure of the slug as well as the colour in this case, so that you know whether you do have a ghost slug or not. If you have a ghost slug, it will not have this mantle area. Also, the group I mentioned earlier, we have the semi-slugs as well. These are a little bit harder to find because they mature only at probably about 3 millimeters adult size in most cases. So really tiny, tiny things. But they're quite commonly found under things like deadwood. It's quite a good way of finding them if you search for them. So as I said about earlier, these have these reduced coiled shells, a bit like a snail, but they're no longer to fully contract their body into them. So for example, in this species, you can see it's tried to pull its head in, and that's as far as it can get, and it can't pull its tail in at all. So it doesn't provide much protection anymore from predators anyway. They also have something unusual happening with the mantle. So as with most snails, they have their mantle kind of where the shell is produced from. But in this case, they've got this lobe, as we call it. So the flesh of the mantle actually extends up onto the shell, whereas in most snails, it's quite separate and they'd actually pull it inside the shell. And in other species, it's a bit more exaggerated. So you can see, for example, here, this flesh is actually coming up onto the shell and growing like this. So quite different looking again. Okay, so to see how much of that you've managed to retain, I have some more polls to throw at you. So what I want you to do for each of these pictures is just to try and tell me which group you think this belongs to. Don't worry if you don't get it right, that's absolutely fine. This isn't an exam or anything, I just want to see if you've managed to understand the concept. Okay. So most people have voted, so I'm going to stop the poll now. All right, and yes, well done. Most people got that correct. Brilliant. So yes, this is a shelled slug. I'll just close this for a minute. So hopefully the giveaway here was this fingernail-like shell on the tip of the tail. I have been a bit mean because in this photo the slug is actually contracted, so it's completely sucked its head in, so you can't actually tell which end is the head end, and its shell is a bit camouflaged against the ground, but this is actually a shelled slug. This is Testacella marmagii in case you're interested. So these have a more of a browny colour and then a pink sole of the foot as well. It's quite a unique colour for the shelled slugs. Okay. So next one for you. Okay. Brilliant. Great job, everyone. Again, most people got that completely correct. So again, if I close this, so this lovely raised crinkly keel here should have been a nice giveaway that this is in fact one of the keeled slugs going all the way along the centre of the back there. Okay, a slightly trickier one for you maybe. Let's see if I can. There you go. All right, I will stop the poll now. Again, brilliant job, everyone. Most people got that correct. This is one of the short-keeled slugs. Might have thrown you a little bit because there is no obvious keel at all, which this species doesn't have at all, but it gets put in the short-keeled slugs. Okay, and last one. Okay, I'm going to stop the poll. Brilliant, most people got it again. Nailed it, you guys are on fire. Fantastic job. So hopefully that nice plug of mucus hiding the mucus pore didn't trip you up, and you can see this kind of stripy foot fringe as well. So yes, this is one of the roundback slugs, the Arionidae. So just to reassure you, slugs are a really difficult group to identify. Even I struggle after many years' experience, and it helps to be honest with yourself and realise that you're never going to be able to identify every single slug you find. Even I know that. I'm really struggling at the moment because I'm having to identify a lot of juvenile slugs, which are incredibly challenging as well. Some species in particular do require examination of the genitalia to actually tell which species they are. So for example, if I skip back a moment to this species here, this is one of the Ambigolimax species. Although in the guide they do show some differences, and there can be some differences in markings. There's a lot of variation between populations, and two species can have incredibly similar markings. So that's Ambigolimax nictilius and Ambigolimax valentianus. They both look pretty much identical, though there can be a lot of variation. So one of the interesting things about this is both of these species are non-native and were accidentally introduced in the 1930s to Britain. And they first were introduced to glass houses, but then they spread really rapidly out into the outdoor environment. So they're quite commonly encountered now, particularly if you're looking in a garden. So it's just worth being aware that in this case, you would not be able to get to species level. You can definitely get it to one of those two species. You could say it's definitely one of those species, one of the Amblyomma species, but you wouldn't be able to get it definitely to species level without resorting to dissection. It's just impossible, unfortunately, at the moment, until more work has been done on that. What's also challenging about that particular slug, again, I've got another picture of it on the slide here, is so when you compare it to our native leopard slug, I've not really given you much of a sense of scale here. They do look superficially quite similar. This is actually an adult leopard slug, and you see it's really big, and the Amblyomma species reaches at least, well, probably less than half that size, so it's a lot smaller. But then all slugs hatch from eggs as miniature versions of themselves and grow to full adult size. Some species will actually change slightly in appearance as they mature, so they will develop slightly different markings and different colours in some cases, whereas some will look like miniature versions of the adults. In this case, these two species can look incredibly similar as juveniles. So sometimes it can be hard even to separate these two from each other to know whether you are holding a juvenile leopard slug or an adult Amblyomma species. So it can be very, very challenging. So don't be disheartened if you are starting out on your slug identification journey and you're finding it really hard. It is hard. We know it's hard. I'm trying to make it easier for everyone and trying to create these tools to help you out. But slugs are challenging. It's also worth talking about names. So I've been a bit naughty today. I've been using a lot of common names, but generally with slugs, we tend to stick to scientific names. This is simply because scientific names are recognised globally. So I can talk to a researcher from France or Spain or from Greece, wherever, about a species, and I'll use a scientific name. There might be some slight differences in pronunciation, because I know I'll mangle my pronunciation horribly, but we'll still know what species we're talking about. Whereas if I use the common name, they might not be familiar with the English version. Common names can also be incredibly regional, so different people in different parts of the country might call the same species a different common name, which gets confusing. And it's also worth pointing out that pretty much every single slug found in Britain at some point has been called a garden slug, which is very unhelpful when you've got 44 different species. So I've just pulled out one example here to try and illustrate this. So Durosus reticulatum is the common name of this, sorry, the scientific name of this tiny little white slug pictured above here, which can be really variable as well. It's commonly called the reticulate slug, the field slug, the grey field slug, the milky slug, the netted field slug, the grey field slug spelt slightly differently, and the grey garden slug. So you can see there's a lot of different common names going on. However, it is also worth pointing out that because of our understanding of the slug fauna has changed, and because taxonomy changes as well along with that, sometimes they also change scientific name. So in this case, at one point it was Agriolaemax reticulum, I think. So when you're talking to researchers who might have done their research 30 or 40 years ago, they'll sometimes use the old scientific name, and then you have to try and figure that out. So it's not always straightforward with the scientific names either. It is worth pointing out also that common names can be misleading. So for example, we have the large red slug as a common name for Arion rufus, which is a really common native species with that bright orange stripy foot fringe. And the annoying thing is it's not always red. It can also be orange, it can be yellow, it could be brown. So calling it a large red slug isn't always the most helpful thing to do. However, in that case, it's a direct translation of the scientific name, which is Arion rufus, rufus meaning a reddish in colour. So I think they shot ourselves in the foot with the scientific name there to confuse us. Not very nice. Then you've also got cases like the Spanish slug. So this one hit the media big time about 10 years ago now, when it was accidentally arrived here from Europe. It's been spreading throughout Europe for many years, and it's a major plant pest, so there's been a lot of concern about that arriving. But calling it the Spanish slug is a bit misleading because it's not thought to originate from Spain at all. So we tend to avoid using that as a common name now, but just because it suggests a life history, that might not be the case at all. So it's always worth thinking about what names you're using when you're talking about slugs. Generally, the scientific name is preferred, but do be aware that in some of the older literature, some of the older guidebooks as well, the names will be different to the ones that we use now. Which brings me on to identification resources. So if you are feeling enthusiastic about identifying slugs and want to have a go, I'd really recommend getting the Slugs of Britain and Ireland, the FSC guide, which is published by the Field Studies Council, sorry. It generally retails at about £15, so it's maybe a little bit pricey, but it is worth pointing out that it's usually included in the FSC January sale, so do look out for it in January. It often comes down to at least £12, maybe a little bit less in some cases, but it's well worth the money. It's a fantastic book. It's the one that I refer to. I even got to go on a trip to the US last year and visit the national malacologist there, whose job is just basically to identify any slugs or snails intercepted on goods coming into the US. Even they use this book. It's that good that they were saying that they use it all the time. The photos in it are just fantastic. They're really good illustrations. I mean, it's never going to be perfect. No ID guide is perfect, but it is a really helpful book to have. So I'd recommend that one. It's easily the best ID guide for slugs out there. However, if you don't have that kind of money to spend, there are some free resources available as well. So you could use some of Brian Eversham's guide, who's a very knowledgeable person on slugs. He's often updating these keys. I think he last updated them in 2018. They're freely available from the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire website, so you can easily download them as a PDF, and they're pretty decent keys. They're not quite as detailed in terms of photographs though, so there's not a lot of photos in there, but there's a lot of useful information and you can still get it down to species level. It just doesn't quite have the same depth as the guidebook. If you want to keep things simple as well, you could also look at things like the Nature Spot website. They have a slug and snail section, which is generally pretty reliable. It has a lot of photos on there of different species. It is worth pointing out that this website focuses on species found in Leicestershire and Rutland, so it might not include every single species present in Britain and Ireland, but it's quite a nice reference to go to as well if you want to look at some photos of slugs. There's also a Mollusk Island website. This is a fantastic one. Though it was only last updated in 2010 because it was a particular project that the funding has ended for. But it's a really good photo gallery put together by an amazing slug expert, Roy Anderson, who is an amazingly knowledgeable man. It has some really good photos and great species accounts of slugs in Ireland. It is worth pointing out it focuses on Irish species, and you can only browse the website by species name, so you actually need to know which species you want to look at when you go there to be able to look at it. So there is no key on there, but again it's got some really good photos and some really good descriptions of species. And there's also the Conchological Society of Britain and Ireland website. We do have a very basic online key, but it's missing a lot of species. But there is a lot of general information on there about mollusks and the Society's activities, field meetings, things like that. Obviously with COVID, a lot of this has been disrupted this year. But if you do want to go out on a field meeting with some really knowledgeable people who know a lot about slugs and snails, this is a good place to start. They also love organising field meetings in association with other organisations and groups. So if you have a particular site you want to have a field meeting related to slugs and snails on, usually reaching out to these guys is a good idea because they're usually interested in that kind of stuff. Hopefully at some point we can all start doing that kind of activity again. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about biological recording. So hopefully some of you are familiar with the concept of biological recording already, but in case you're not, I'm just going to explain a little bit about what this is. So it's really simple. It's just a point on a map of a species, where it is. So it's very important to have what species you found, where it is exactly, when you found it, and who actually found it. So who found it can be your name as the recorder and the person identified it if it wasn't you, or the person who helped you with identification. And the more precise you are with this information, the better. So having something as being exactly at that moment in that time is really useful for research, but it's also really important for supporting policy as well. Which is my next point really, is that these records are super important because it informs research like mine, but also it lets us understand any changes that are happening with a species being present or absent in an area. This is particularly important when it comes to slugs because as I've talked about earlier, we're seeing a lot of dynamic change, a lot of species changing range or being introduced. And some of these are spreading at detriment to some of our native species and causing, or seems to be contributing some declines. So it's really important to have those records coming in to help us evidence this type of thing and help us keep track of those non-native and invasive species as well. Records are often used to inform legislation on protection of sites and species as well. So again, it's really, really important having that data available to people making those decisions. They do actually use it. It can also help us target conservation efforts on species and habitats under threat as well. So really, really important to have your biological records coming in, and they are actually used, a really important resource. So for example, I'm using biological recording in part of my PhD research to evidence a change in two species. So over time, we have noticed some shifts in these two species. So the species on the left is the yellow cellar slug, Limicus flavus, which was first recognised as being in Britain in the early 1600s. There's a lot of debate as to whether it's native or not. Again, coming down to that idea of, it has to have been here since before the Ice Age to be considered native, or just after the Ice Age. And one of the challenges we have with slugs, although they do have that internal shell, they don't tend to fossilise that readily, and they do decay very quickly. So the fossil record for slugs is pretty small. There's not a lot of information out there, so it's quite hard to decide whether something is native or not. And there's a lot of debate happening about that. But coming back to this species, it's been here definitely a very long time. And if you look at all the distribution maps of all the records throughout time, it looks pretty widespread, absolutely everywhere, particularly in the south of the country here. However, when they produced that FSC guide in 2014, they could only find good representatives of that species from parts of South Wales and parts of Devon. So this area in the yellow circle, just a few sites seem to have it, and they really struggled to find it. What actually seems to have happened is since the 1960s, a second species arrived, known as the green cellar slug. Looks very, very similar, has very similar ecology and diet, but it seems to have replaced this species completely. So it spread very rapidly throughout the country into the same range that the yellow cellar slug was once in. So there's something complicated happening here. What's actually even more complicated about this story is we know that the yellow cellar slug is very strongly associated with houses throughout history. So it's got a strong association with human habitation. So it used to be quite common to find them in houses, hence the name cellar slug. So one theory is that as people have made their houses warmer and drier, it's become less suitable for this slug, and maybe it's declining for that reason. But then you also have the problem of that the green cellar slug can actually hybridize with the yellow species, and it seems to outcompete it genetically. So the offspring of these two species together seems to look more like the green cellar slug. So basically their genes are being watered down and they're being bred out of existence by this friendly rival that's come in. So I thought this was a really interesting story, and I really want to evidence this because it's hard to know from these records how much of this is based on recent records and mistakes in identification, things like that. So I actually launched as part of my PhD the cellar slug survey. So that's simply asking people to go out into their own gardens, see if they could find this slug, see whether they have the yellow slug species, the yellow cellar slug species, or the green cellar slug species. And you can get involved in this survey. You can just do a one-off hunt in your own garden or someone else's garden if you have access to it. If you just go on the RHS website, we've got a simple ID guide on there, which shows you exactly what these species look like. So the yellow cellar slug here and the green look very similar in that they have this greenish colour and also this yellowish mottled pattern to them as well. And they have this these blue tentacles as well at the front of the slug. If you see this blue tentacles and this greeny, yellowy mottled pattern colour to them, you can instantly say it's one of these two species because they're the only species present in Britain to have these colour combinations. So they're quite a nice, easy to identify slug species in a way. The juveniles also helpfully look like miniature versions of the adults. So at most life stages, you can tell what species you have of these. The difficulty comes when you're actually trying to separate the two species from each other. The yellow cellar slug has this unbroken yellow line along the centre of the back here. They also have this kind of finer look to them because they have these finer texture to the skin, what we call the tubercles here, which is the raised bumps on the tail. So as soon as you see this unbroken yellow line, it's very likely you have a yellow cellar slug. But it is worth being aware that the green cellar slugs sometimes have a short yellow line, or they have a mottled kind of pattern that almost looks like an unbroken line, but is actually just a random pigment placed around almost like one. We've also included the leopard slug here because often what we found talking to people was they were mistaking cellar slugs for leopard slugs. They hadn't realised that they're a separate species. So the leopard slug again looks quite similar and can be a similar size as adult as well. But instead of being this greeny yellow colour, they are always a browny or grey colour. And usually they have more stripes on the tail than this kind of mottled camouflage pattern. They also have reddish tentacles as well, so completely different body colour and tentacle colour going on there. But these are some really nice species to try and find. So they're very nocturnal, so it's usually the best idea to look at night when they're out and about actively crawling. But again, you can find them resting in things like compost bins or under stones in the garden as well, or in the habitat you're looking in. What's interesting about the yellow cellar slug as well is I mentioned that it was mainly limited to human habitation. The green cellar slug seems to be much more tolerant. So that's another theory as to why it might be so widespread, is it actually does occur in natural habitats as well. So it has been found in places like woodland, often resting in things like bird boxes or any nest boxes like that. Sometimes you'll find it in there. So I thought I'd have a little look at where these slugs are in Warwickshire. There were 7 records of the yellow cellar slug in Warwickshire, ranging between 1965 and 2015. Most of these were actually earlier, so 1965 probably to about the 1990s. So there's very few records of this species, so challenge for you, see if you can actually find it. There were 13 records of the green cellar slug, which is not bad. There's a few around. Most of these records, again, between 2011 and 2019, so it just gives you an idea of how recently this has started being recognised as being here. So all the green dots on this map are the green cellar slug and all the yellow are the yellow cellar slug. So you can see there's a lot of gaps still. So do get out there and have a look for these species if you can. Slugs in Warwickshire overall, not too bad. There's about 702 records of 27 species present on the National Biodiversity Network Atlas. So these are records that I could freely download. And you can see that the effort has varied quite a lot over time. So during the 1960s, there was obviously a lot of interest. I think this might have been when a mollusk atlas was produced for the county of Warwickshire. So that would make sense as to why that is such a big jump there. And there's also been spikes in 1999. Again, there was another mollusk atlas produced for the UK at that time. And interestingly, a spike in 2017. I'm not quite sure why that one's there, but it's interesting to see that. So it's varied a lot over time. And generally quite low numbers each year. So you can see there's only a maximum of 48 records in one year in this graph. So we do need more people out there looking and getting to record slugs. I also thought I'd look at one of those species of conservation interest to see if there were any records around. So I looked at the lemon slug. So if you remember, that was that yellow slug found in ancient woodland. There was absolutely no records of this in Warwickshire that I could find on the NVN Atlas. So I was quite interested. So I actually overlaid a layer of ancient woodland. So all of these black kind of squiggly bits you can see on the map here, this is ancient woodland areas, and I'm aware that some of them are in nature reserves as well. So there is potential habitat for this species out there. It just may be that no one's managed to find it, or no one's looked, or maybe they just don't occur in the woodlands in Warwickshire. I'm not sure. But there's another challenge for you. See if you can find this species in ancient woodland. So like I said, there are ancient woodland sites. Now is the best time of year to actually look for these, depending on lockdown restrictions, obviously. If you do get the chance to go out to ancient woodland, it's well worth taking a look. The adults come up to feed on the fungal fruiting bodies, which is why autumn and winter is the best time to actually have a look. The best approach is actually to search during the day under and in leaf litter, especially if there's lots of fungi around. You often find them there. The adults are only about 35 to 50 millimeters long, so that's 3.5 to 5 centimeters, so they're relatively small, but they have this lovely yellow color and these kind of bluish, purplish tentacles. Fairly distinctive, and if you remember, these are part of the short-keeled slugs, so they don't have this an exposed mucus pore on the tail tip. It's really worth pointing this out because there are some similar looking species. Some of the round-backed slugs can also be slightly yellowy and have bluey tentacles as well. So it is well worth, if you do find it, take some pictures if you can and try and get someone to verify it for you, just so that we can make sure that it's not one of the confusion species. But they're generally pretty distinctive, so well worth trying to find that if you can. So once you've found your slugs, what can you do with those records? So you can send your records directly to the local records centre, which is the Warwickshire Biological Records Centre. I'm not sure if they actually have an active mollusk county recorder at the moment. The last reference I could find to one was from 2007. Unfortunately, we're not particularly well connected bunch with each other. So there might be someone on there still verifying mollusk records, but I don't know for sure. It might be worth asking them as well. Just saying, do they have anyone to be able to verify slug records or not? Because the last thing we really want is lots of slug records coming in and them not knowing what to do with it, or to be able to actually verify them and confirm them as correct or not. But yes, do keep in mind that you have a local record centre you can submit directly to. What I tend to do though, and my preferred route, is actually to put all my slug records on iRecord, because we actually have a network of volunteer experts who are verifying the records on there. So I'm actually one of those who does a certain group of slugs on there. So I do the cellar slug records, but I don't really touch any of the others at the moment, by my own choice, because it's a bit overwhelming. So it's mainly Christopher who does most of the slug verifications on there, but he's really active, so he checks the records all the time, and he loves getting back to people with feedback on their identifications and to highlight any errors they might have made or anything like that. Really lovely man, and he loves when people make an effort. So please do stick your records on iRecord if you can. What then happens is any unusual records are checked again by the National Recorder of Non-Marine Mollusks, which is Ben Rosen, who wrote the Slug ID Guide book. So again, really great person. And he actually then downloads, all these records of iRecord and produces an annual report for the Society on what species are where, and just picking up on anything really interesting, to hopefully, encourage some research into particular species if anything's really exciting is happening. And the Conchological Society have had a database of slug or snail records for hundreds of years now, so there's a really good database. What they actually do with their entire database is every year they then upload all those records that have gone through both Chris and Ben, or whoever else is verifying it, and these become publicly available. So they're uploaded directly onto the NBN Atlas, and anyone can then access these. So if you go on the NBN Atlas, type in a species name, you'll be able to see all the records historically, and including all the ones within that past year. And this is really great because it's available then for download for the public, for researchers, but also the local record centre can download the data as well if they want to. So it's a really good resource. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about iNaturalist and Seek. So I'm aware some people might have come across these platforms already. So these are smartphone apps developed for global use. So what you do with these apps is you take a picture of whatever you're seeing, observing, and it will suggest identifications for you, and you can then generate a biological record that way. Currently, iNaturalist and Seek are not particularly well integrated with UK biological recording data flow. So data flow within Britain for biological records is incredibly complicated. So some people have some data and they don't share it with others, and others have data and they share it with everyone. So it's really, really complicated. Unfortunately, iNaturalist, just the way it's been set up, is not quite compatible with our systems. So iNaturalist uses crowdsourced verification. So that means absolutely any iNaturalist user can look at another record and say whether they agree with it or not. So they could say, oh yeah, it's definitely that species. And if 2 or more people agree on a definition, if they say, yes, that record is definitely that species, it gets accepted as research grade. These are starting to now be accepted onto the NBN Atlas, but there's a lot of concern about these because, for example, I've looked at research grade records and realised that they've completely misidentified them. So 2 people have said, yes, it's definitely that species, but unfortunately both those people are incorrect because it doesn't necessarily require people to have a certain level of knowledge to be able to give their opinion. So it's not always reliable, which is why some recording systems in the UK are quite reluctant to start taking those records in. It's well worth being aware if you do decide to use iNaturalist and Seek that the AI can often suggest incorrect species, and often from different parts of the world as well. So for example, it mainly seems to suggest a lot of US species when I use it, but I think you can change the settings within the app to actually say, I'm in Britain, so that it then tries to narrow the list down to the relevant species. But it is something you can use. It is something you can use to develop your skills, but it is just worth being aware of these slight issues and that some of the records aren't always used. So if you get stuck, you're trying to identify slugs and you're finding it hard, there are some places you can go for help. So one is the Land and Freshwater Mollusca of Britain and Europe Facebook group. It's a really active group where you can post pictures and people will try and help you. There's quite a few experts actually hiding out on there. So sometimes they're not always chipping in, but sometimes they will chip in and answer a question that people have. It's generally run quite strictly in that they really like you to have good views and to have had a go yourself before you post something. So for example, you can see their banner picture here is actually the best poses for identification of a snail, so that you make sure that you're using the right photos when you send it in. So they can be a little bit strict on that. But again, a great place for loads of people there who might be able to help you if you have any queries or are struggling to identify something. I'm also on Twitter, so you can always tweet at me if you like, and I can have a look at pictures and see how far I can help you with various pictures. I've also included my email address on there as well, so if you want to email me about any questions or advice, please do so. I'm not always the best at checking my email account, so often it's quicker to tweet at me than it is to email me. So yes, but I will try and help you if you do want any help. You can also reach out to Ben, who is the Honourable Non-Marine Recorder. He is a very busy man, but he's always really lovely when it comes down to being asked questions about identifications. And again, with all of these things, we love it if you have had a go, and if you have a specific question, that's even better. Whereas being sent pictures and just being asked what this is isn't so fun after a while. But these resources are there. We're here to help you, and we're just really excited to have people who are interested and keen to start identifying slugs, because there's not many of us. We're a very small community of people. So hopefully you're feeling confident about getting started with some of the iconic species. You've got 2 challenges that I've set for you. Get out there, see if you can find a cellar slug, yellow or green, doesn't matter which one. We still need records of both. And also the lemon slug. If you can get out into the ancient woodland reserves, nature reserves, places like that, do have a look, particularly at this time of year, see if you can find it at all. Take some photos, prove that it's there. Okay, so if we can go back to this activity. I'm going to stop sharing again for a second. So the link should still be in the chat, so you can just use the same link again. And then I just want you to go down there and again, put on the idea board what you think you know about slugs now. Oh, thank you, Michael John. Yes, okay, there isn't a county slug record. That's useful to know. Some great facts coming in. I'm glad the hard to RD one appeared. Brilliant, great. Okay, so all that's really left to do now is to thank everyone for listening, and make sure you've got my details, and thank all the organisations that have supported me basically throughout this time. We've got 15 minutes left, I guess. So do you want to have this time for questions?
Sounds like a good idea. Thank you very much, Imogen. Excellent talk, really interesting. I'm sure we've all learned a lot about slugs now. And the great thing is that we can go out at this time of year and have a look for them. As you say, lockdown dependent. Okay, so I guess we will just open it up for questions. So as always, if you just want to put on your camera and unmute yourself when you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand either in person or using Zoom, or just go for it and just say something out there. And if you can't or you don't want to show yourself, then you can just write something in the chat. Okay, seems like Michael John's got a question.
Hi, it was mentioned that slugs have, or that mucus is important to identify them, and that they have two types of mucus. Is one type more important than the other for identification, or are they about the same?
Probably about the same, to be honest. It very much depends which species, so it's usually useful to make a note of both. So, for example, there's one species where the crawling slime is clear, but when you rub the side of the body, it produces a bright orange slime. And there's some other similar looking species that have kind of a yellow crawling slime, but when you rub the side of the body, the mucus is clear. And it sometimes can be easy to mix those two species up, particularly when one's a juvenile. So in that case, it's useful to have a record of both if you can, just because you might have to come back to looking at that. I mean, we don't rely on mucus too much, but sometimes you do just need to use it as a supporting thing for identification. So yeah, useful to have knowledge of both.
Okay, so when the SFC guide talks about mucus, because it doesn't mention that there are two types, does it mostly refer to one or the other, or?
Yeah, it mostly refers to crawling mucus.
Okay.
And it's just a couple of species where it will talk about body mucus, and that's when it's referring to like rubbing it to see what colour the mucus is.
Okay, thank you.
Emma, do you want to go?
Hi, yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. It was really interesting. I definitely learned a lot. And my question actually maybe is more for Debbie. In terms of ancient woodlands in Warwickshire, where are the best places to go and have a look?
I'm not sure quite where you're based, but some of our kind of best woodlands that we have, and certainly that are trust reserves, are Wappenbury Wood and Wrighton Wood. They're probably a good bet to go looking for woodlands, I would say.
Cool. They're only like 10 minutes away, so
great.
No excuse.
Go and have a look for those lemon slugs.
Yeah. Cheers. Thank you.
Becca, if you want to go.
Yeah, hiya. Again, that was like really interesting. Thank you for the talk. I was interested when you said that like different species can hybridize. When they have like offspring, can those offspring then go on to reproduce, or are they kind of like, I don't know, like with like donkeys and horses, they have mules but they can't reproduce, so they're not a species?
That is a great question, and it's still something that is being studied a lot, because it certainly appears that in most species that can hybridize, their hybrids can go on to then reproduce, which creates even more diluted hybrids, which makes it even more complicated. And there is the potential that at some point in the future, some of those species will just be new species, or they'll have merged into one species, which is completely inseparable.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
great question. As far as I know, I don't think there are any species that hybridize that produce infertile offspring, but who knows at this point.
Sounds confusing then.
Yes, it's really confusing. There's so much work being done on it just because it is such a complex issue and it's multiple species. So for example, those large Arians, so the large red slug, the large black slug, so Arian rufus, Arian aeta, and Arian vulgaris, which was the Spanish slug I talked about, which is the invasive species. They can all hybridize with each other, and then it gets really messy. So there's a lot of research being done on that because obviously 2 are native and 1 is invasive. So it's quite important to unpick that issue, but it's really complicated.
Thank you.
Sally, if you want to go.
In terms of like life cycle, how long do they spend like as eggs, and like how long do they take to grow to full size, or is it different for everything?
Another great question. It's very much dependent on species again, and also environmental conditions. So for example, some species mature in a really short space of time. There's some species that are thought to just be annual. So they'll live for a year maximum and then they'll die off and the next generation will continue. Whereas other species are thought to live for at least 2 or 3 years, maybe even up to 5 years in some cases. And it doesn't always necessarily go with size. So some of those really large species, like the Arians, coming back to those really big ones with the stripy orange foot fringe again, that are really commonly encountered, it's thought that many of those only live for a year. So they basically hatch at the beginning of the year, and then by the end of the year, they're adults, and that's their whole life cycle. Whereas things like the leopard slug, so again, quite big slugs, they will live for probably several years, and it can take up to a year for them to actually reach maturity and adult size. So they're much slower growing. But then you've got the little species, so like the netted field slug I talked about when I was talking about scientific names. That is really fast reproducing, can reproduce several times within a year, but again has a really short lifestyle, so it dies generally within a year of hatching out. And that's what makes it a pest species really, is because it can reproduce so many times throughout its life very rapidly and mature so quickly. So yeah, great question, and not a simple answer again. Slugs are complicated.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if Michael John, you had another question or your hand is just still raised from last time. If you do have another one, go for it.
No, I don't have another question.
Okay, no worries. All right, cool. Well, if you do think of any more questions that you do have, I will be sending out an email with resources that Imogen mentioned, and some of those links as well. And feel free to email me, and I can either try and answer it or pass that query along if I don't know the answer, or have a look in my trusty FSC guide that Imogen mentioned.